A setback in the search for the Falklands settlement. The Peruvian plan, which could have brought a ceasefire tomorrow, collapses. Mrs. Thatcher repeats there can be no ceasefire unless Argentina agrees to withdraw from the Falklands. Official casualty figures from HMS Sheffield: 20 sailors presumed dead and 24 others injured, one of them seriously. But first, another statement on the Falklands crisis is due from the Ministry of Defence, and we're going over there straight away to hear from the Defence spokesman.
I have another announcement to make. As part of the continuing enforcement of the total exclusion zone, 2 of our Sea Harriers went out on patrol this morning. The weather and the visibility were very poor. At noon London time, contact with the Harriers was lost. We do not know the reason for this. In view of the time that has now elapsed, the aircraft must be assumed missing. No further details are available at present, but search and rescue operations are now in progress. The next of kin are being informed.
Earlier in the day, Mr. MacDonald spoke to reporters about the casualties sustained when HMS Sheffield was hit by the Argentine missile.
20 officers and men serving in the ship must now be presumed dead. 24 of the crew sustained injuries and are receiving medical attention. Only 1 of these is on the seriously ill list. The further 242 survivors are all well and have been transferred to other ships of the task force. All next of kin have now been informed.
We'll be returning to that story in just a moment. Argentina has rejected a peace plan which would have produced a ceasefire in the South Atlantic at 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The plan was put forward by Peru with strong American backing and would have brought a step-by-step withdrawal by both the forces of Britain and Argentina. That would have guaranteed that Argentine soldiers would have pulled out of the Falklands as Britain demands. Britain has always had much greater hopes of this plan than of the much less specific ideas proposed by the UN Secretary-General. Argentina, for its part, much prefers the UN suggestions, which carry no clear guarantee of an Argentine pullout from the islands. In Brussels, NATO has declared its support for Britain in the dispute and condemned Argentina. But in Buenos Aires, the mood has clearly hardened. Keith Graves reports on the Argentine rejection of the Peruvian plan for peace.
The collapse of the Peruvian peace plan is a serious blow to Britain's hopes of ending this conflict by negotiation. If they had agreed, there would have been a ceasefire at 5 p.m. tomorrow, London time. Though no one is admitting it, it seems likely that the lull in the violence during the past 48 hours has been not unconnected with Britain's hopes that the American-backed Peruvian plan would achieve something. Mr. Pym, the Foreign Secretary, said tonight that he was deeply disappointed that Argentine intransigence had once again frustrated a constructive initiative. If they had genuinely wanted peace, they would have accepted these latest proposals, he said. Mr. Pym is to make a full statement to the House of Commons tomorrow morning, at which time he's expected to make plain just what Peru was proposing. But I understand that in broad terms they suggested a ceasefire, a staged withdrawal of forces so Britain could ensure Argentina had pulled out before the task force finally withdrew, an interim administration to include both parties plus other countries acceptable to both, and a conference to discuss the long-term future of the islands. The plan left that last point at that, making no direct reference to sovereignty. London had hoped that that would be enough for Buenos Aires. There were broad hints throughout the day of an important announcement pending. That was to have been the ceasefire announcement. But 3 hours ago, Britain's ambassador in Washington, Sir Nicholas Henderson, was called to see Secretary of State Haig to be given Argentina's rejection decision.
Sir Nicholas Henderson spends more time at the State Department in a day than most other ambassadors in a year. He was back with Mr. Haig today and was told that the Peruvian peace plan had apparently foundered. That means the State Department is left with the United Nations peace plan as the only game in town. Something the administration's spokesman on the crisis may not have been briefed on. That was the President himself in one of his question and answer sessions with reporters in the White House Rose Garden.
I'm not going to single out any particular approach that we're pursuing, but we're open to every approach that can. We now have the help of the President of Peru, who has involved himself in these negotiations. We'll do whatever we can to help.
But even as he spoke, the Peruvian initiative had apparently collapsed. Diplomacy, so far as it offered any hope, had switched back to the United Nations track, and Mr. Reagan may have reflected this in an answer to a question about superpower involvement.
Frankly, I do not see the danger of this escalating to that extent. And the steps that we're taking are the steps that we've always been taking, and that is seeking within, as I say, the UN framework, this kind of a resolution that calls for ceasefire and calls for withdrawal of all forces while this is done. Now, so far, there has not been agreement on that.
The failure of the Peruvian initiative is almost as big a blow to Mr. Haig as the end of his own personal diplomacy, and the Americans now can only look to the United Nations for results. As for the British, the forum doesn't matter so much so long as the basic requirement is met of withdrawal before negotiation. And the tragedy of it all, as seen from Washington, is the waste of time involved in all the diplomatic switching about. The lull in fighting is not a ceasefire, and it can end at any moment.
All that's left diplomatically, then, is the United Nations. The Secretary-General put forward what the Foreign Office calls some ideas and what Mrs. Thatcher called today a framework with no timetable to Mr. Pym, where they dined in New York at the weekend. But Britain is very happy with UN Security Council Resolution 502, calling on the Argentines to get out of the Falklands. Whitehall doesn't want to broaden the debate by throwing it into the UN forum. So there's been some stalling going on in the hopes that the Peruvian plan would work. Earlier today, though, we did give what was described as a constructive response to the Secretary-General. The Argentines went further, saying they accepted his suggestions. Michael Cole is at the UN.
At the United Nations, Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar gave a guarded welcome to Argentina's acceptance of his ideas. The British ambassador, Sir Anthony Parsons, personally delivered Britain's positive reply.
I would characterize our own response by saying that it is substantial and that it is constructive.
The UN ideas are in no sense a substantive peace plan, but they could provide the framework for one. The ideas comprise a ceasefire, the withdrawal of both sides' forces, temporary United Nations administration leading to negotiations. The ideas studiously avoid the crucial issue of sovereignty, by far the biggest stumbling block. It's Britain's view that were Argentina to agree to withdraw its forces in an unequivocal way, then other diplomatic moves would begin to flow here at the United Nations. For its part, Britain wants to avoid the issue returning to the Security Council, which would only lead to a noisy international row and the possible use of the British veto. Britain would prefer to rely on the quiet, behind-the-scenes diplomacy of the Secretary-General as the best hope of progress towards peace.
It's easy to see why the Argentines would prefer to use the United Nations. A debate in the Security Council would give the Russians, who desperately need Argentine meat and wheat, a power of veto. And the UN is a lumbering machine. Nothing happens there very quickly, and time is not on Britain's side. The Argentines, on the other hand, can afford to string this crisis out, as Michael Burke tells us from Buenos Aires.
There's been no real shift in the Argentine position over the Falklands. The United Nations peace proposals are so vague that Argentina can accept them without compromising on any of the basic issues. That acceptance does not mean the government here is prepared to withdraw any of its troops or accept a United Nations peacekeeping force without explicit assurances on its ultimate sovereignty over the islands. And sovereignty is not even mentioned in the peace plan. The general terms of the United Nations proposals have been accepted here because it's felt that time is on Argentina's side, and because the attack on HMS Sheffield has restored military pride after the sinking of their cruiser, the General Belgrano.
When she spoke in the Commons this afternoon, Mrs. Thatcher was still hoping the Peruvian plan would work, but she obviously had some doubts and made Britain's position very plain.
It may well be likely that the Argentines are concentrating on a ceasefire without withdrawal. That would be a very evident ploy to keep them in possession of their ill-gotten gains. And we are right to be very, very wary of it. The whole of the mandatory resolution 502 has to be accepted. And there can be no ceasefire unless it is accompanied by withdrawal, which is fully and properly supervised.
Mr. Nott, the Defence Secretary, has been in Brussels today explaining Britain's position to NATO defence ministers. They expressed support for it. Mr. Nott, like Mrs. Thatcher, is anxious to keep pointing out that negotiations are the desirable course, but if they fail, force is the only alternative.
Into the future, there can be no question of our turning back from the military objectives which we have set ourselves and the necessary defence of our own forces from continuing Argentine attacks. But we are still looking, and will continue to look, for a peaceful solution. We are launching yet another political initiative with this aim. Yesterday, my colleague, the Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, put a new set of proposals to the United States in their role as a mediator, which we hope will be supported in other countries. Our continuing efforts to find a peaceful solution will not falter, but I must stress that these efforts can only be based on the precondition of Argentine withdrawal in accordance with Security Council Resolution number 502 in all its parts. If we have a ceasefire without Argentine withdrawal, democracy will have surrendered to aggression, and the aggressor will be in possession of his spoils.
Well, however reluctantly, Mrs. Thatcher must now use the United Nations. She can't afford not to if she's to hold worldwide support and support at home. But there are no real hopes that the United Nations will be able to persuade the Argentines to pull out and to agree to talks without preconditions, without saying, as they have so far, yes, we'll talk about sovereignty, but at the end of the talks, sovereignty will be ours. It's being pointed out, though, that the UN must operate within the framework of Security Council Resolution 502, and that benefits Britain. But one Whitehall source said tonight, they, the Argentines, appear to think they can get a ceasefire and get the task force off their back without pulling out of the islands. And he added, they're wrong.
That was our diplomatic correspondent, Keith Graves. Now for more about the loss of 2 Harrier jets and the casualty figures from HMS Sheffield, back to the Ministry of Defence and our reporter, Nicholas Witchell.
The loss of 2 more Sea Harrier fighters, as announced by the Ministry of Defence spokesman just a few minutes ago, will certainly be seen as a serious blow to the task force in the South Atlantic. Ministry officials are saying that there is no indication that the loss was due to enemy action. As the statement said, they went out on patrol and contact was lost with the 2 jets. It's thought that they must have ditched somewhere in the sea. Quite apart, though, from the tragedy of the deaths of 2 more Fleet Air Arm pilots, it means that there are now only 17 Sea Harriers aboard the 2 aircraft carriers in the South Atlantic. Their task is certainly onerous enough, with about 60 Argentine fighters available to combat them. There are about 20 more RAF Harriers en route to the South Atlantic at the moment. Their role will be more and more vital to establish the crucial air superiority over the Falklands. Earlier this afternoon, in questions about the loss of HMS Sheffield, the ministry spokesman was asked about plans to bring forward the scheme to equip more vessels with the Seawolf missile. That's the weapon that can shoot down enemy missiles and which might have saved HMS Sheffield had she been equipped with Seawolf. Mr. MacDonald said that this was now a major priority which had been underlined and re-emphasized by recent events. Now, back to the studio.
As details of casualties were passed to Britain, the Navy stepped up its help and advice for bereaved families. and those worried about their relatives in the task force. 8 information centres are now operating at naval bases around the country. The biggest of all of them is at Portsmouth, as Andy Webb reports.
HMS Nelson is the shore base where much of the fleet's paperwork is handled. It's in an office on the first floor that they carry out perhaps their most difficult job. Since the task force sailed, centres like this have been taking up to 1,000 calls a day. Instead of a handful of people supplying routine information, there are now more than 60 staff at Portsmouth alone, working 24 hours a day. Part of their job is to squash rumours and correct what they see as damaging reports. But in the confusion, hasn't the Navy made mistakes as well?
In the initial stages, really one wasn't quite sure who was missing and who was not. And that takes a long time to sort out. So there was always the question of, do you tell somebody too soon? Do you wait? And is waiting reasonable when it's known that a lot of people may well be worrying that their husbands are lost and they're not? And also one has to remember that there was embarked press in other ships and the information was coming or might come back by other routes. So we needed to get there quickly and get it as accurate as possible.
The Navy says it will man the telephones as long as the crisis lasts. And from next week, there'll be regular newsletters from every ship in the task force. The plan is that they'll be printed in their thousands and sent individually to the families for whom any news is better than none.
As we've heard, there was some confusion over casualties from HMS Sheffield. One mother suffered the ordeal of being told first that her son was missing, then that he wasn't, and then again that he had been lost. Earlier today, Tim Hurst spoke to her.
BBC calling Falklands.
Most people ring in with their messages for the Falkland programme, which is broadcast at tea time every day.
Hello, Jack and Ivan. Hope you are both all right and well. Hope to hear from you soon.
Yes, well, I'm sorry, in all the confusion, and you can imagine there is quite a lot of confusion here. We've used the wrong film. Despite the diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the Falklands conflict, British troops may well be needed to retake the islands. Ships and men gathered off Ascension Island have been preparing for such an invasion. Jeremy Hands, who's on board the requisitioned liner Canberra, reports on the last few weeks of hectic activity.
With the rest of the task force already at sea, the ships that would be involved in any amphibious landings met up here at Ascension Island, a barren volcanic waste just a few miles across in the middle of the South Atlantic. These are the ships that will carry the men and equipment needed to retake the Falklands by force, equipment going the slower way by mobile pontoon. And once
she's been completed ahead of schedule, but the Ministry of Defence says it can't confirm her movements. And the completion of a Type 22 frigate, HMS Brazen, being built at Yarrows on the Clyde, is being brought forward to next month. She was due to be completed in September. The Broadsword-class ship will carry Seawolf anti-missile missiles. And on Tyneside, the Navy's latest aircraft carrier, Illustrious, is being hurriedly fitted out. Shipyard workers are trying to bring her completion date forward to next month. Illustrious, sister ship of the Invincible, is designed for anti-submarine use and to act as a possible command ship. Now back to the question of the casualties from HMS Sheffield. The mother who suffered the ordeal of being told first that her son was missing and then that he wasn't, and then again that he'd been lost. Early today, Tim Hurst spoke to her.
Andrew Swallow, a former Sea Scout, is officially listed as missing after the cruel twist which allowed his mother first to believe that he had died and then that he was alive. She received the first call on her birthday at home in Bembridge.
Later yesterday afternoon, we got a call from a padre in Portsmouth to say that he had been found safe and well. And then again, about 2 or 3 hours later, we had another phone call just to say that we had been misinformed. And that, there it has been left, unfortunately. So we still, as of this morning, know that he's unaccounted for.
You, if I may say so, seem to be holding up very well indeed.
Yes, I think it's something that every mother lives with when you've got a son in the Navy and when you know they've gone into action. It must be in the back of your mind. When you've got other members of the family around, especially younger members of the family, it doesn't do them any good to see you keep breaking down. And I do feel that the one thing that I want everybody to do is to talk about Andrew and not to hide him away and not to be scared to talk to me about him, because I'm proud of him. I'm extremely proud of him. I feel that if he's gone to war and he's fought for his country and probably died for his country. I'd like everybody to feel that it's not in vain. I mean, if the Argentines are now prepared to talk, I feel that his death won't be in vain. It might even prevent a world war.
This is Jill Swallow. Friends and relatives of the Falkland Islanders are keeping in touch through special programmes from the BBC's Overseas Service. The programmes are broadcasting personal messages as well as news. Peter Main's been to the headquarters of the Overseas Service at Bush House in London.
BBC calling Falklands.
Most people ring in with their messages for the Falkland programme, which is broadcast at tea time every day.
Hello, Jack and Ivan. Hope you are both all right and well. Hope to hear from you soon. Keep your chin up. We are all thinking of you. Love, Doreen, Bob and Vicky and all the family.
I hope Rachel got...
But some actually come into the studio.
Hello to Rachel, Anne, Cindy and Joanne. How are Nanny and Grandad? I hope Snoopy the cat is not getting too fat.
Well, we've had over 2,000 phone calls so far, sending messages from relatives and friends here in this country, and we've also had phone calls from as far apart as Holland, Paris, Dublin, Guernsey, and all over this country.
And how many people are actually listening to the broadcasts in the Falkland Islands?
Well, we think there are about still 1,600 of them, and we know that they are still listening because people have still got their shortwave sets. They're listening on cassettes because they're recording the programme on cassette and passing the cassettes around to each other.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Rachel and Jay. Happy birthday to you.
To help pay for its military effort, Argentina's junta under President Galtieri has devalued the peso, imposed tougher duties on petrol and tobacco, and taxed the foreign currency holdings of banks. Among other measures, petrol prices have been put up 30%. And Argentine television has been relaying pictures of the reunion of survivors from the cruiser General Belgrano and their families. Here's Michael Burke again.
The survivors of the General Belgrano are now national heroes, and a squadron of transport aircraft was sent down to the south to bring them back for an elaborately staged welcome. No list of casualties has yet been published. The Navy says only that the ship's crew was over 1,000 and 800 were saved. Some, the Navy says, spent 48 hours in fragile rafts. As soon as they arrived, they were lined up on the tarmac to cheer for the fatherland. Then a Marine band struck up as they marched off to meet their relatives. It was an emotional moment. News of what the Argentines are calling the most successful naval rescue in history was slow to come out, and many relatives had spent 2 days thinking their sons and husbands were dead. The authorities capitalized on the emotion. The survivors, they said, want nothing more than to go to sea again to fight for the Falklands. To the people of Argentina, the garrison troops in the islands are heroes too. Centres have been set up all over the country where volunteers make up thousands of food parcels to supplement army rations. It is, they say, a spontaneous gesture of solidarity with the armed forces, but it's being used to boost civilian as well as army morale. A general is conveniently on hand to say the garrison troops are happy, warm and well fed. They're faring better than they would in their own homes, he says. He won't say how the carefully wrapped parcels will get through the British blockade around the Falklands. The government maintains the blockade is ineffective. The cakes, chocolates, cigarettes and sandwiches will get through, they say, in the same way military equipment does. Most Argentines seem bewildered by the fighting and are praying for peace at special masses, like this one for the university in the capital. The theme is peace with honor. At a time when new talks may be in the offing, it's worth remembering that for Argentines, the one is as important as the other.
There was a certain amount of criticism from Conservatives in the Commons this afternoon of the way television and radio have been reporting the news about the Falklands. One Tory MP asked Mrs Thatcher for her comments, and this was her reply.
Judging by many of the comments I've heard from people who watch and listen more than I do, many people are very, very concerned indeed that the case for our British forces is not being put over fully and effectively. And I understand that there are times when it would seem that we and the Argentines are almost being treated as equal and almost on a neutral basis. And almost sometimes, I understand, there are occasions when some commentators will say, well, if the Argentines did something and then the British did something. I can only say that if this is so, it does give offence and cause great emotion among many, many people.
The BBC wasn't specifically mentioned and isn't, of course, answering for all the broadcasting media. But the BBC's response to such criticism has been to say that while it can't be neutral as between our country and an aggressor, one of the things that distinguishes Britain from a dictatorship like Argentina is that our people wish to be told the truth. But when bad news has to be reported, there's always the risk that the messenger will be blamed for the message. Today's local elections in England and Scotland are dominated by the events in the South Atlantic, the vote seen as a pointer to what the public thinks of the government's handling of the crisis. The elections are also a big test for the SDP Liberal Alliance, fighting their first nationwide campaign. 48,000 seats are being contested in 183 councils. An opinion poll by Maury for The Economist newspaper shows Conservative support fell from 43 to 38% during this week, which saw heavy loss of life in the South Atlantic. Labour and the Alliance made gains, but the Conservatives remained ahead. An important area in today's elections is Manchester, one of 10 metropolitan districts at stake in England and Scotland. Labour's defending a 35-seat majority on the Manchester Council of 99. Good weather encouraged the turnout, but elsewhere rain and snow kept voters away. 32 London boroughs are also being contested, as well as 103 English towns and another 12 in Scotland. The results will be in Newsnight on BBC2, starting at 1:15 midnight. And now the main points of the news of the Falklands crisis. Argentina has rejected the Peruvian peace plan, which would have produced a ceasefire in the South Atlantic by tomorrow afternoon. It was a plan in which Britain had much greater hopes than the less specific ideas proposed by the UN Secretary-General. The Ministry of Defence has just announced that 2 more Harrier jets have been lost. They went missing on a flight in the exclusion zone. The official casualty figures on HMS Sheffield were 20 sailors dead and 24 injured, one of them seriously. The Sheffield's captain, James Sam Salt, has been speaking about the gallantry of his crew.
All the people that I have spoken to, and I have spoken to them all, and Mike, my first lieutenant, has spoken to, really are remarkably careful, philosophical, and determined, really, about the future. Obviously, it's a fantastic disappointment to lose your ship, and I suspect this will be a day or two before we realise the full impact, personally.
Captain Salt of the Sheffield. And that's all from us. Good night.